Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we are going to be talking about Battlegrounds Season 9, my predictions, kind of expected MVPs or some other, champions that might shine, and all that other good stuff. I know that Season 9 is definitely bound to be one of the more popular ones with the increase in rewards in Alliance event and the solo event. A lot more people definitely will be paying attention to Battlegrounds. Also, fact that Alliance War is off, and let's face it, now that we have a week off Battlegrounds, the game feels completely dead. So, because of that, I do think that there will be a lot more people trying, and therefore, by extension, also there will be a stiffer competition, which is something that you probably need to account for. But let's take a look at the victory track meta. Specifically, this video is going to be dedicated to the victory track meta. I'm not going to be talking about weeks 1 and 2 Gladiator Circuit meta in a separate video, but I will eventually be making video discussing the meta that's going to start week 3. Right, so we're going to have to deal with buff toggle unstoppable. Every 9 seconds the defender gains an unstoppable buff for 3 seconds, and then whenever return policy, whenever any of the defender's buffs are nullified, they gain a 60% of battle power, armor break, debuffs, nullify, armor up buffs. Then we have Dauntless. The attacker starts with the spirit gauge at 50%. Fair enough. So what do I think of this meta? I think it's fine. I think with buff toggle unstoppable 2 specifically, you will likely and largely be able to play around the node relatively comfortably, because you will have large enough of a window to open the opponent, and dealing with the 3-second unstoppable really isn't that long of a time. So at large, I think in victory track meta, you will still be able to pretty much run, if not all, then vast majority of the champions that you would normally run. At the same time, obviously, you will need to be vigilant, and there will be champions that are much harder to use because of that. For instance, champions like, let's say, Adam Warlock, because Adam Warlock can't take a break in a fight. You can't dash back and, wait for 3 seconds. You really do need all that time to be offensive. And there will be champions that have these timers and deadlines, basically, that can't really play freely. But that said, let's just go over class by class and see which champions are going to be the MVP. So obviously the return policy is kind of meant to stifle the Mystic class, who will all be more powerful because of it. At the same time, I think that in between a rare unstoppable buff nullification, you can deal with the node. So a lot of champions that do nullify will still function perfectly fine. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue, but there will be some champions that deal with it better than others. And if you paid attention to the wording of return policy, then it specifically states nullification. So if you are forcing opponents' buffs to expire quicker, that's not an issue. They will not be gaining those chunks of power, or neutralize will work as well. So in these cases, we will have 2 specific champions that will be significantly stronger than normal, because not only that unstoppable buff effectively will heal these champions' abilities to inflict additional degen, or in case of Absorbing Man, pause his forms, they will also feed the Mystic Dispersion with literally no downside, and therefore will enable Mojo to be more, capable offensively. So I do think if you do have a rank 4 Mojo, that's going to be a very good meta for him. And then a champion like Dr. Doom, because Dr. Doom does nullify, but it's good when opponents get more power, because Dr. Doom thrives in situations where opponent has a lot of power and you get to steal it. Therefore, you get to your special attacks quicker. And yes, Dr. Doom is definitely going to be a very, very viable option as well. And here I think is going to be something very interesting with Spider-Man Supreme. I do think there will be some matchups where he's potentially worse than he normally would be, but we definitely need to pay attention to his always active ability when each unique buff on the opponent reduces their ability power rate by 33%. This power denied is transferred to Spider-Man. So if you're going to end up using a Spider-Man against a champion that typically does have like a buff active, let's say just the one, then by default, you will be placing your spider seals on your opponent, which would end up with a reduction of 66% of whatever power they would gain whenever you nullify your own spider seals. And therefore, yes, the opponent will be gaining some power, but so will you, and a lot of it. So I do think that Spider-Man 2099 is somebody to watch out for, because he could theoretically quite effectively supercharge himself in due to return policy. He doesn't really interact with the Unstoppable, other than the fact that he will trigger his blessing from the astral form, because it triggers automatically um, when opponent activates unblockable, unstoppable buffs. So this will obviously, uh, be something to keep in mind. So I do think that it will be quite interesting to see how he interacts. Obviously, Tiger is going to be an absolute nuke, and in general, I will not mention the Battlegrounds stable champions, because Archangel is going to bypass the node. Human Torch is going to have plenty of firepower to work in that meta as well. But another champion I wanted to point out is the Dragonman, because Dragonman also will be one of those champions that benefit a lot, because he doesn't nullify the Unstoppable, but on level 1s he does have access to that slow. The slow isn't too long, but with the fact that Unstoppable will also be feeding his Mystic Dispersion, the fact that you can corner opponent, be super aggressive, keep throwing your level 1s, and the fact that we do have a lot of 7-star Dragonmans in the game, I do think that if you do have a 7-star Dragonman, then definitely it's a champion that you should probably put in your deck. Juggernaut's still going to be destroying everything left, right, and center. If need be, he can utilize the stagger ability to bypass that Unstoppable. Or if you make a little bit of a mistake, you will still be unstoppable, and you'll be able to save yourself. And the last but obvious champion is going to be Absorbing Man, who reduces the duration of unstoppable buffs by 90%. Just like Mojo, it's not nullification, so opponents will not gain extra power, but you will as soon as those buffs expire. So Absorbing Man is going to be significantly faster and more dangerous than he would be in kind of like a generic vanilla circumstances. Right, and then we obviously have Rintra, who's a solid neutralized champion. Going in tech class, I think tech class in itself doesn't really have access to a lot of great champions that would function around the Unstoppable. Out of all of the things that tech counters, there are not many champions that ignore Unstoppable or has access to slow. And on top of it, there are champions like Omega Sentinel, who requires ability to land her hits frequently, that will definitely be significantly harder to run. For the most part, as I said before, most of the tech champions will function fine. You're gonna need to play around stuff, but Nimrod is still gonna destroy the mutants, and Warlock is still gonna be fine. Shuri is gonna function just well enough, I think, and so on and so forth. Some champions that I think will thrive more so, and yes, I know that there's Silver Centurion that does have access to slow and a couple of others, but let's face it, you're not gonna be running them too much. I think Future Ant-Man is going to be pretty much a perfect champion for this type of situation, because Future Ant-Man is a type of champion that can quite easily just hold his block, force his opponents to glance, and just wait out the Unstoppables, because that is kind of baked in half of his playstyle anyways, where you just hunker up, bait opponents' heavy attacks, and then punish them. So the only thing that is going to change for Future Ant-Man is that you will play exactly as you always do, except that there will be the odd heavy attack now and then that you cannot punish. And with his power control, I think he's going to be one of the kind of more solid tech champions in the upcoming meta, and obviously he's a great dual-purpose champion. And I do think that starting against Spider-Man, out of all of the tech attackers, is probably the champion whose playstyle interacts the best with that unstoppable buff, and with you being forced to kind of like wait a little bit, because you do spend a significant portion of the fight with starting against Spider-Man kind of like dexing and not actively attacking anyways. So when you're going to be using starting against Spider-Man at large, you can just benefit from that unstoppable to replenish your spider poise charges, or whatever they were called, and you're not really missing out, because if you just hit opponent for, let's say, 3 seconds, but you're running low on charges, you're not doing that much damage. But instead, taking those 3 seconds to get in a dex or two to replenish some of your charges and then return back on the offensive, effectively this node doesn't really slow him even down, because normally when champions would have this brief period where they cannot attack, you're missing out on damage output. But Spider-Man starting hands can turn that wait period into a damage ramp up. Therefore, it's not detrimental to wait out that Unstoppable. Now, moving on Cosmic Class, in Cosmic Class, there's, again, not many champions from Cosmic Class really interact with Unstoppable or how much, like, to do with it or to say. We're going to have our regular Cosmic Nukes. Gallon is going to work just fine, not a big deal if you need to wait for 3 seconds. CGR is going to work perfectly because you will be able to Fate Seal the Unstoppable if need be. And as soon as you Fate Seal, opponent's power locked as well, so you can, get a solid opening there, and you do not need to worry about them gaining power. Hulkling is very similarly like Starkenhand Spider-Man, perfectly capable of dashing back and waiting 3 seconds, so you don't really lose out on much damage because he's replenishing his shapeshift charges. And let's face it, when you use Hulkling, you often do something similar in the fight anyways, where you just dash back and wait a bit for your shapeshift charges to build up so you can, get your pierce aptitudes and go unblockable in your level 2. So I think Hulkling is going to be very, very dangerous and will not mind that Unstoppable at all, really. Then moving on to Science Class. Science Class, I think, is going to be a tricky one because, as I said, most of the champions are capable of playing around those things anyways, but you do want to take a look at champions that obviously does have access to slow or stagger. Now, with Titania, obviously, when you're going to be staggering the opponent, they will be gaining more power, but I don't think it's going to be too much of an obstacle for Titania, given that she reduces opponent's combat power rate on her base, and then staggering your opponent's Unstoppable will still enable you to be very aggressive, which is kind of like the point of Titania. And then you can just go in for your level 3 and kill the opponent, because typically a rank 4 Titania going up against the chunkiest opponents, if you're doing everything correct, will finish that fight after level 3 spamming heavy attacks. So I think Titania is going to be quite valuable in the upcoming meta. And we definitely need to highlight Spot as well, because I think Spot is going to be an amazing dual purpose champion for this first meta. The reasons being is that despite having no direct counter for the Unstoppable, he can kind of ignore it, because the way you spend time in a fight with Spot is either you're blocking or you're untouchable for most part. So you don't care if opponent is unstoppable if you're blocking. Nothing changes for you. And if you're untouchable, well, you also don't care if opponent is unstoppable, because you can just keep spamming your hits as is, and your opponent's going to try and hit you. The only thing you have to do is time your special attack to make sure that the opponent can't block it in the middle of special attack. But due to his untouchable and your ability to pause the untouchable every time you land a hit, you will easily outlast the duration of opponent's 3-second unstoppable whilst hitting them in a face, thus not being affected by it at all, really. So Spot is going to synergize perfectly with it. We obviously have Mr. Fantastic, who also has access to his stagger. Doesn't require you to be mega aggressive against the opponents. And when you stagger the opponents, will be able to mitigate opponent's power gain. So I do plan on running Mr. Fantastic, and I think he's going to do great. Other than that, obviously, there will be more science champions that are, perfectly viable. There is plenty of slow that you can find in science class. But what I think is, because this node is not super intrusive, and most champions can play around it, you will not want to run, let's say, She-Hulk if you normally don't run her anyways. You can just easily run your better science champions. You can still run Scorpion. Yeah, opponent's going to go unstoppable now and then, but Scorpion is still overall going to be much, much, much better champion than somebody that does slow. And this is, I suppose, the second piece of advice. Just because a champion does have access to slow or will be able to deal with unstoppable, does not mean that you should prioritize adding those champions to your deck if they are overall of, let's say, lesser quality. Because I don't think that node is going to be as intrusive for most of the champions. And you should still run the champions, that are objectively the better ones. Right. Moving on to skill class, I think Shang-Chi is going to be an absolute MVP. Shang-Chi obviously has one of the best slow mechanics in the game. Shang-Chi is a very solid attacker. I might finally pull the plug and end up taking Shang-Chi to rank 4 specifically because of this meta. Because, yeah, opponents' unstoppables will not slow him down at all whatsoever. He's just going to steamroll it. Super easy to maintain at least a couple of stacks of slow on the opponent pretty much at all times. The rest of the nodes are whatever, and he's just a solid Battlegrounds offensive champion. And obviously then we have Valkyrie, who quite literally will just ignore the Unstoppable the entire fight, and you can completely forget about any of those nodes existing. So I think Shang-Chi and Valkyrie are going to be two best skill offensive champions. And solid shout out here, I think, could go to Hawkeye, especially if you do have like a duped 7-star. Unduped 7-star, his damage output isn't going to be as great, even though he will be able to deal with the Unstoppable perfectly fine. But if you do have this guy duped, then that's pretty much all you need, and he will do extremely well because he does have access to slow, very easy access to slow on his heavy attack. It's not the longest one. You just need to make sure that you activate your heavy attack, every now and then. And then you can just spam your level 1s, be mega aggressive because you have power drain and you will be reducing opponent's combat power rate very significantly. And I do think that Hawkeye will surprise a lot of people, especially if you do have a duped 7-star. My 7-star is unduped, but I'm still kind of thinking of maybe potentially running him. Because in theory, he sounds pretty much perfect for this lane. I just wish mine was duped so he could actually get the critical bleed damage. That's a very important thing. Now in Mutant class, obviously aside from Archangel, champions that deal best with this node, I think Bishop is going to be great. Because Bishop is a champion that, doesn't aggro rush the fight anyways. With Bishop, you often want to get in a whole bunch of parries and do like 2 or 3 hit combos anyways. And then if you are going up against like skilled champions that purify your stun, then you get the longer passive stun while you still can, hit the opponent even though they're going to be unstoppable. So I think Bishop is going to effectively completely ignore this node due to his playstyle. So I think he's going to be a very, very solid champion to run. And then we also have Danny Moonstar, who has a very solid and easy access on level 1. So I do think you're probably going to want to end up doing level 1, level 2 with Danny Moonstar. Get that slow active, then play as aggressive as you want, and just finish the fights off with level 2. So I do think Danny will do quite well in the upcoming meta. Other than that, as I mentioned before, this meta isn't the type of meta where you need absolutely specific type of champions with like immunity or something like that. For most part, you will likely be able to run pretty much anything anyways. So ultimately, the champions that I highlighted, I think out of the respective classes, are the ones that can deal the easiest with this node. But much of it is going to be a skill issue and the way you adapt your playstyle. And Kitty Pryde, she has nothing to deal with that Unstoppable, but I'm sure she's still going to do absolutely phenomenal. Like Domino is still going to be running all over the place and so on and so forth. There are not many champions that will care about that Unstoppable node to a point where you can't really use him. So let's see how it works out. I think it's fairly straightforward. Obviously, then we have Gladiator Circuit nodes with the addition of Slap Me Not, making some opponents go stun immune whenever defender is immune to or inflicted with a nullify fate seal stagger. So I do think this is going to be a bit trickier. I don't think it's that big of a deal either. Let me know what are your thoughts and opinions about upcoming Victory Track meta in Season 9. Definitely is also going to be interesting to see how well champions react to the change to the scoring system, where remaining health now is more important than the speed that you finish these fights, even though obviously speed still matters. And let me know whether you're looking forward to Season 9 of Battlegrounds. I can catch you guys soon. Bye. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about